Have you had the experience of someone putting a narrative on you? Telling you what it is you're really going through? What your life experience really is? That your version of events, your events, is wrong, actually? I imagine many of us have. Black folks' experiences with law enforcement, women's experiences with healthcare and in the workplace, any individual's exploration of gender. In all these examples, real-life situations that our friends and neighbors and many of us go through every day. You start talking about them and you've only got to wait around a few minutes before the naysayers arrive. These folks will take one look at a situation and declare, often loudly and extra obnoxiously, and totally removed from the situation, like a bigoted Statler or Waldorf. Apologies to Jim Henson, of course. But these folks will declare that this is the real story of what you're going through, that you don't understand your own experiences, and that only up there in the peanut gallery can one possibly see what is truly transpiring in the world. The fact that my own experience of this dynamic is somewhat limited is certainly a function of the social privilege thrust upon me by an unjust society. But I do recall the bizarre disconnect I felt in those earlier days of the pandemic when confronted with what people outside the city thought was going on here. My partner and I stayed in New York. We did the complete isolation and then the slightly expanded pod thing, you know, your top 10 friends who agree to a no contagion bubble, as we sat around and waited for that vaccine to get finished. It was a scary time, yes. It was also kind of, I don't know, dreamy. There was death all around in a way that many of our fellow Americans simply did not witness. But under that shadow, all sorts of strange and imaginative sprouts pushed through our earth as well. We got into roller skating. We biked 15 miles to the beach every week. We got into weird art projects, made ambient music, learned to cook, or at least cook better. We cheered on hospital workers. And at least for my partner and I, we got to know our neighbors in a totally new way. And don't get me wrong, I do not want to romanticize this time. But when we would get calls or texts from fox-watching family members far away, and they would worry so much about how we were surviving a city descending into a hideous crime wave, one that, mind you, deftly managed to remain invisible to even the most fastidious crime statisticians. Well, those calls felt disorienting, frustrating. In the face of a truly epic disaster, I felt the city coming alive in a different way, stepping up as neighbors and banding together, pursuing creative solutions to new problems, and looking out for the least of these. Why couldn't these other folks see that? Why wouldn't they? And how dare they claim authority over my account of what's going on? I imagine that some of these same feelings took root among the Corinthians in that early church. Here they were, doing something new and exciting and radical, bearing witness to the resurrection, taking a leap of faith, committing themselves to the well-being of their neighbors and sharing so that there was enough for everyone. And you know what they were accused of? Incest, cannibalism. I mean, my gosh, how disheartening is that? To be so maliciously misunderstood. And not just by an overeager aunt, not just by a nosy neighbor, but by the government itself. It's a horrible feeling, especially for a people who have been instructed to love their enemies, which ultimately means that on some level you do have to care what they think. And so Paul recognizes this moment and does something beautifully pastoral. Without denigrating their accusers, he tells the church in Corinth, all those accusations, all that misunderstanding, It's the opposite that is true. We are becoming God's righteousness. We are welcoming everyone. We are enduring hardship. We are reflecting and growing in our spiritual lives. We are true, well-known, living, rejoicing, abundant people of God. It's a bit of a pep talk. It sounds like they needed it. Boy, I know I do these days. But as I've thought on this passage, I found myself wondering more about what was being said about these early Christians. I think most of us have a sense that early Christians were persecuted in the Roman Empire, but the representations of it that we see today tend to boil it down to martyrs being brought before Roman officials to simply claim or disavow their faith and then be dealt with accordingly. Now, these stories are true as best as we can know, but on their own, they make it seem as if Rome was trying to regulate people's inner lives in a way that would assume such a high level of omniscience as to seem ridiculous. And it also has the more subtle effect of reducing Christianity simply to belief claims. Now, it's not like the early churches were keeping minutes on their meetings, so it's not easy to reconstruct what exactly they were up to. But I did dig up a letter between two Roman officials discussing the Christian problem. And it sheds a little light on the situation. I'll note, this letter is about 60 years after Paul's, and it concerns churches in modern-day Turkey, not Greece, so consider the parallels with a grain of salt. But Pliny, a Roman governor, is writing to Emperor Trajan about the spread of Christianity and his efforts to contain it. The problem is, he doesn't know what to charge them with. So he writes his boss, the emperor, describing what these pesky Christians are up to and looking for guidance on punishment. On a stated day, writes Governor Pliny, they had been accustomed to meet before daybreak and to recite a hymn among themselves to Christ, as though he were a god, and that so far from binding themselves by oath to commit any crime, their oath was to abstain from theft, robbery, adultery, and from breach of faith, and not to deny trust money placed in their keeping when called upon to deliver it. When this ceremony was concluded, it had been their custom to depart and meet again to take food, but it was of no special character and quite harmless. Those degenerates! They're going to tear this country apart! I jest, of course, but even Pliny himself is having a hard time articulating what exactly these Christians are doing wrong. It's later in the letter, when he shifts gears to assuring the emperor that he has everything under control, that Pliny drops a few clues as to the real problem. He describes these trials where they pull in accused Christians and pressure them to renounce their faith in court. And as he's telling his boss of their success in unconverting people, Pliny points to two things as proof that the strategy is working. One, an increase in attendance of civic religious ceremonies such as parades and public sacrifices, all of which rely on and reinforce the image of the emperor as a supreme god. And two, an increase in the complementary businesses around that worship, meat for sacrifices and such. See, the problem with Christians wasn't so much that their inner spiritual lives as the ways that their faith led them to divest from the culture and economy of emperor worship. Refusing to put the emperor above Jesus, above God, tore at the very fabric of what held the empire together. The Romans were perfectly happy to let the people worship in any way they wanted, you see, as long as it was in addition to the public worship of the divine emperor. Christians said no, and that was a problem. And they took their money with them. That was a problem too. It's funny how the powerful don't care much about what you do so long as the money keeps flowing to them, isn't it? Divestment is a quiet but pernicious protest. But something that stands out to me in this letter, and hinted at in Paul's language as well, is that the Roman government truly and earnestly did not even understand these Christians. They didn't see this as a religious crusade for the emperor's honor so much as a strange incident of their tried and true assimilation policies not working. This wasn't Rome's first rodeo. They had conquered and absorbed many indigenous cultures and religions, and they had a way of doing so that ensured the empire and economy would grow, while local cultural practices could persist, albeit in an altered fashion. But the approach wasn't working with these Christians, and you can see the bewilderment in the way they talk about it. They really did think these guys and gals were crazy. What Rome offered was protection, new construction, big public building projects, roads, long-distance communication, all that infrastructure, plus membership in the greatest empire the world had ever seen. You'd have to be crazy to say no to that, right? And what they couldn't see, what the governor only knew from hearsay, was that these Christians weren't just divesting from Rome. They were turning around and investing in their neighbors instead. The poor and the downtrodden. The least of these, just as Jesus told them to. And they did so quietly, almost secretly, just as Jesus had instructed. And the treasure this practice yields, the joyful fulfillment of spirit that comes with a gospel-driven life, it's just not easily perceivable from either the peanut gallery or the throne. What you would see instead is a bunch of strange people celebrating for no obvious reason, making unprofitable investments, inexplicably unafraid of a government who has proven many times over that they will use state violence to quell resistance. One might call these people imposters, part of an unknown or unpopular movement. You might see them as dying, as punished, as sorrowful, poor, having nothing to their names. But that would be your narrative, not theirs. And it's not ours. Implicit in the act of putting a narrative on someone else is the assumption that there cannot be a good reason they are this way, that their perception of the situation is inherently flawed, and so is, therefore, their ability to explain it. And so you don't see Pliny and Trajan asking, why are the Christians this way? We call people crazy when we don't want to hear their explanations, to do the work of understanding. It lets us close the book of the other's mind so we can move on to other things. But contemplate with me now. Why did the early church look like this? How were they able to live this way? The way. To muster the courage to live abundantly under Roman rule. To do as Jesus taught, despite the state's death threats, despite certain neighbors' suspicions. The answer is simple, which is not to say that it is easily comprehended, nor that its meaning is small. The answer is that Jesus conquered death. The resurrection changed everything. Jesus didn't eliminate death. Indeed, it is very much a part of life. But he stood up and told us that death does not have to be our master. We do not have to let it have the final word. That, Jesus proclaimed early on a certain Sunday morning long ago, belongs to God. And to truly believe this deep in your bones is to be free. And not the cheap, do whatever I want freedom that is both the promise and limit of worldly power, but the freedom to love fully and completely both God and your neighbor without fear. It is not the freedom won by fighting, but a freedom found in realizing in seeing, in transcending that which tries to bind us in this world. Hear again the words of Psalm 103. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy, slow to anger and of great kindness. He will not always accuse us, nor will he keep his anger forever. He has not dealt with us according to our sins, nor rewarded us according to our wickedness. These are the words of a free person, celebrating and rejoicing in the mercy of a God who knows us, who wants us to shine as beacons of her righteousness in this world. The psalmist knew this long before Jesus was sleeping away in a manger, and they even tell us why. For God himself knows whereof we are made. He remembers that we are but dust. Being made of dust, this is not something to be pitied. It's not a put down, a shrinking, nor is it cause for resignation. Rather, it is cause for celebration. How incredible that we who are dust, mixed with a little spit and the breath of life, get to live a life at all, get to encounter one another, to encounter our Creator. How incredible that our most important mission, our one big assignment, is to love each other as we are loved by God. Even Carl Sagan, a personal favorite of mine and very much not a Christian, famously said, "The cosmos is within us. We are made of star stuff. We are a way for the universe to know itself." In its own somber and humbling way, our common mortality is a door to our universal humanity. I'm no expert on Buddhism, but I've always had friends who practice, and I've often found its central questions and ideas to be quite animating, even in my Christian context. Perhaps especially in my Christian context. But as a casual outsider, I always had a hard time grasping this fundamental notion they talk about of non-attachment. If you're not familiar, the basic premise is that attachment leads to suffering and hinders our spiritual growth. Now, a real Buddhist would be able to speak much more meaningfully to this, but as a baby in that universe, I could never quite wrap my head around it. My impediment, the blockage in my understanding, has always been that I have a hard time conceiving of how to love without forming attachment. I used to think that those were essentially the same thing, and so I imagined a conflict between these two traditions. My Christianity calls me to love the world, and so I cannot pursue non-attachment, was my thinking. But what I have learned is that this seeming paradox is actually very close to the heart of both traditions. Now, I'll leave Buddhism alone for now, lest I impeach myself through my own ignorance. But speaking now in our Christian context, let me ask you, what does it look like to love without attachment? To love your neighbor without attachment? Your family? Your city? Your country? Would you love differently, giving full acceptance to our inevitable return to dust? I'm not saying I've arrived at this place, but I do know that we are called to it. What attachments are harder to let go of right now? What attachments will your heart simply not release? Perhaps there are some upon which you even consciously choose to tighten your grip right now. I certainly know that's been true for me lately. These are not questions for answering tonight. These are questions for contemplation. Questions that may be your companions in this season of Lent. Tools to pry open the doors and cabinetry of your heart as you search it together with God, listening to the quiet words of the Spirit. Starting next Wednesday, we will begin hosting a weekly evening prayer services at 6:30 in here, and perhaps you'll bring these questions back with you as we sit in prayer. But for now, for tonight, let us be content sitting in that mystery, allowing some things to remain unnamed. And when we go out into the world with these ashen reminders of our mortality upon our brows, let us be content knowing that few will truly understand what we do, that these are marks of freedom too. See, now is the acceptable time, says Paul. See, now is the day of salvation. Do you hear it?